That's a kangaroo there. Meanwhile, in Australia, their lockdown has been extended, now entering its 3rd week. This is a serious lockdown. It's kind of like what they pretend lockdowns in the US were like. But anyway, it's going through July 16th, and here's what's going on in Australia. There have been more than 300 COVID infections linked to a limousine driver who tested positive back on June 16th. He is thought to have been infected while transporting, you guessed it, a US flight crew from Sydney Airport. Now, I don't know for sure that they know that that's for sure where it's from, but that's the belief. And last week, almost half of Australia's population was locked down, with cities on the east, west, and north coast tightening pandemic restrictions due to clusters of infections that had developed. Some of those lockdowns were as short as 3 days. Sydney and its surrounding areas are the only part of Australia still in lockdown. And the main reason for this is that only about 9% of Australian adults are fully vaccinated, heightening fears that the Delta variant, or maybe the new Lambda variant, could quickly spread beyond control. So right now they are taking it very seriously. They have been taking it about as seriously, Francesca, as any country in the world throughout this thing. We're gonna give some of those updated numbers in a second, but just a few infections are enough for them to seriously lock down a significant part of the entire country.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if we cared about human life that much. 300 people getting sick. I mean, yeah, and it will, like, it'll be okay. They will be able to control it because they are taking 300 cases seriously. So when the next pandemic rolls around, yes, I said it. We need to look to countries like Australia, but sadly, oh God, we're just gonna have the same debate over and over again about masks and freedom and etc. And I do think it is interesting because, I don't think that anyone would say that Australia is China. I don't think Australia is, like, in terms of, there's been a narrative which is like, well, if your country is a little bit more totalitarian, your government is a little bit more iron fisted, that you can, like, it's bad for democracy, but it's good for, like, controlling the spread of a disease, right? And a virus. But Australia is kind of proving that that's not the case, that you can still be, like, a fine democracy that doesn't have, like, certain web pages X'd out that you're not allowed to visit, or, like, tracking opposition leaders, and also not give up your, like, so-called freedom in order for the benefit of the entire nation. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. I'm gonna disagree slightly with one thing that you said there. When you talked about us, in the next pandemic, which now is gonna become a thing, we're gonna have the same debates, sort of, but not exactly the same, because there's not gonna be that first month or 2-month period where right wingers are, like, looking to their God figures, like, how should I respond to this? They're just instantly gonna be opposed to literally anything being done. Like, not just I don't want a vaccine, I don't want you to wear a mask. That's what we're instantly gonna have on day one. So that's gonna be fun. Now, there were other ways this could be done. Australia is another example. Australia has been relatively successful in containing clusters throughout the pandemic. That's according to the AP. They've had fewer than 31,000 cases and 910 deaths. And since October, they've recorded one COVID-19 death, an 80-year-old man who died in April after being infected overseas and diagnosed in hotel quarantine. Which isn't even really a case for them then. And by the way, as with any country, it is possible that there are people who've gotten sick, people who've died that aren't being included in these numbers. I certainly can consider that as a possibility, but it is clear that they have been far more successful, even accounting for the smaller population. They've been far more successful. Right now, there are 37 COVID-19 cases in Sydney hospitals. 7 are intensive care, the youngest in their 30s. As a reminder, people in their 30s can get COVID and can get hospitalized by it. But this is them taking it seriously in the absence of vaccines. And they don't have 9% of their population vaccinated because they believe Tucker Carlson. It's not that sort of situation. A lot of countries like the US have bought up the supply. I don't know all of the things influencing vaccine availability in Australia, but it is almost certainly not the same as the US, where the remaining people who don't want to get vaccinated, the last 40% or so, are just choosing not to because they believed something, Naomi whatever said or whatever on Twitter. So they're doing what they can.
Well, I mean, and this is a perfect example, right? Because it's like, like the Bible, doesn't the Bible say something about the last shall be first? Well, guess not in COVID, because if you are, have the lowest number of COVID cases and you do a really, really good job, you don't get vaccines. And that is, something that, while I am very, very grateful that I have been vaccinated and that Americans have access to the vaccine, it is not lost on me that other countries that have done a better job containing the virus are not getting the vaccine. And Australia is a great example. And many, many other countries around the world where they're not poor countries, right? So they're not gonna necessarily qualify for the COVAX program, right? They are not but they have done a very good job within their limited resources and limited capabilities to limit the spread of the virus. And there is literally no reward for that. No one is helping them, either develop their own vaccine, give them the, capability to develop the mRNA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's just not on the books. So I can only imagine as an Australian how frustrating that must be, because you don't get a cookie. Your cookie for not spreading the virus is just staying alive. And there's really not an end, and getting access to cookies, and there's not really an end in sight. So I can only imagine just how upsetting that is.
Yeah. So look, we talked yesterday about Marjorie Greene saying literally in a tweet, nobody cares about the Delta variant. Well, that's not true. Some people do, and people who could theoretically die in Australia if they treated science the way Marjorie Greene does, could have died and will not now, because Australia is taking it seriously. Whereas in some states, in some areas in the US, COVID is once again on the rise, which means in a few weeks, hospitalizations will be on the rise, which means in a month, deaths will be on the rise. Hopefully not to the extent that they were in past waves. Almost certainly not, because the majority have now been vaccinated. But we are gonna once again have a bunch of deaths that didn't have to happen because we've chosen not to do what other countries have shown works.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.